Over 80% of Soviet casualties in certain offensives were classified as avoidable by their own commanders. But the reason they kept attacking wasn't what you've been told. The truth is way more complicated and way darker than Cold War propaganda suggests. When you hear about Soviet soldiers in World War II, you probably think of endless waves of men charging toward enemy guns with reckless disregard for their lives. That's what we've been told for 80 years. Brutal Soviet commanders throwing soldiers at Germans like they were expendable. Crazy tactics that don't make any sense. But talk to the historians who actually studied Soviet combat records, read the testimonies of survivors, and you'll find out something completely different. These weren't mindless cannon fodder. They were conscripted civilians, many of them farmers and factory workers, trapped in a military system designed to break them or kill them. So what really happened? Why did millions of Soviet men get sent into attacks they couldn't possibly win? Let's talk about the truth that both sides tried to hide. The Red Army started the war completely unprepared for anything the Germans threw at them. Stalin had purged most of his experienced officers in 1937, replacing them with political loyalists who had no idea how to command troops. These weren't military professionals. They were Communist Party members who'd been promoted because they were ideologically reliable, not because they knew anything about warfare or military strategy. When Germany invaded in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet military was a complete disaster. The Germans caught them completely off guard. Millions of soldiers were captured or killed in the opening months. Entire armies just ceased to exist. Soviet generals were arrested and executed for losing battles they never had a chance of winning. The Germans pushed hundreds of miles into Soviet territory before the Red Army could even organize a proper defense. Stalin was furious. He demanded counterattacks. He demanded his generals push back the Germans. He didn't care how many men died doing it, but Stalin couldn't call a retreat. That meant failure, and failure meant death. Retreating meant execution by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Retreating meant your family got sent to the gulags. Retreating meant your name would be erased from history. So he did the only thing he could do. He kept sending more soldiers forward, and more, and more. The idea was that eventually, sheer numbers would overwhelm the Germans. It didn't work at first. It just killed millions of people for no strategic gain. The Soviet army was also desperately short on equipment. In the early part of the war, soldiers would be sent into combat with one rifle between two men, or even less. When the first soldier got killed, the second one picked up the rifle and kept going. This wasn't just brutal propaganda. It was actually happening. Surviving Soviet soldiers testified to this in interviews after the war. Officers would literally tell them, "You don't have a rifle, so when the guy next to you dies, grab his." They'd push forward without weapons, knowing that they'd probably die. There's a famous Soviet propaganda film that shows exactly this. Soldiers charging forward with no weapons, and the Soviet government actually admitted this was happening. They said it was a sign of Soviet courage and willingness to sacrifice. But it was actually just a sign of complete desperation and lack of equipment. Soviet soldiers were also fed terrible rations. They were moving constantly, fighting without rest, in conditions that were absolutely brutal. Winter in Russia is brutal even without fighting. With fighting, it was hell. Soldiers were freezing to death. Many of them didn't have proper winter clothing. The German army was also unprepared for Russian winter, but at least Germany had captured Soviet supply depots. The Soviet soldiers had nothing, and when soldiers started getting sick or wounded, there wasn't enough medical support. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Men died from infections that could have been treated with basic antibiotics. The Red Army would just move forward and leave the wounded behind. Sometimes Soviet soldiers would find wounded men from the day before, still alive but abandoned, with no way to help them. Wounded men would beg to be killed rather than be left behind to freeze to death. Add to all this the blocking detachments. Officers posted behind the lines whose job was literally to shoot Soviet soldiers who tried to retreat. Not capture them. Not punish them later. Shoot them dead right there. Some Soviet soldiers were more afraid of the gun behind them than the enemy in front of them. There are documented cases of entire regiments being held in place by blocking detachments while they were surrounded and slaughtered. The orders were clear: advance or die. Either way, you're not leaving. But here's what people don't understand. These soldiers kept fighting anyway, not because they wanted to. Not because they believed in communism or Stalin or anything like that. Many of them hated Stalin. Many of them had seen the purges. They'd lost family members to the secret police. Some of them came from areas where Stalin had deliberately starved people during the collectivization. They had every reason to hate the Soviet government. But they kept fighting because their families were back home, and if the Germans won, their families were dead anyway. The Germans weren't fighting a conventional war with the Soviets. Hitler had made it crystal clear. This was a war of extermination. The Nazis wanted to wipe out the Slavic people and take their land for German colonization. They'd already started killing Soviet civilians before they even finished conquering the territory. German soldiers were under orders to shoot civilians, to burn villages, to take everything that could be transported and destroy everything else. There are reports from Soviet survivors of entire villages being burned, women and children being shot, food supplies being confiscated. The Germans were implementing Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space for Germans. The Soviet people had to go, either through deportation or extermination. Soviet soldiers knew this. They understood that no matter how bad things got, surrendering to the Germans wasn't actually an option. It was either fight or die, often both, so they kept going. They had nothing to lose. Their families were being murdered anyway if the Germans won. At least if they fought, they had a chance to stop it. By the middle of the war, the Red Army started getting better. They had better tactics, better equipment, and better training. Soviet generals like Zhukov figured out how to actually organize massive offensives. They learned from their mistakes. They stopped making some of the same stupid tactical errors, but the cost was still absolutely staggering. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 involved over 3 million soldiers. It was the largest tank battle in history. The casualties were in the hundreds of thousands. Over 300,000 Soviet casualties in some estimates. And the Soviets won, but barely. They won by throwing more men at the problem until the Germans ran out of ammunition. The worst part is that even when Soviet offensives succeeded, the cost was often not worth it from a conventional military standpoint. They'd lose 200,000 men to advance 50 miles and capture a destroyed city that the Germans had already burned on their way out. Meanwhile, German casualties were high too, but Germany couldn't replace their losses like the Soviets could. So in the cold calculus of Soviet warfare, it made sense to trade lives for territory and time. Eventually, there just wouldn't be any Germans left. Soviet commanders started understanding something important. Germany couldn't afford to lose soldiers. Germany had a limited population. Germany couldn't pull millions of men from the home front without collapsing the economy. The Soviet Union could. Stalin had millions of men. He could lose hundreds of thousands and keep fighting. So the strategy became attrition. Keep attacking. Keep pushing. Keep forcing the Germans to kill Soviets. Eventually, the Germans would run out of men to kill. It was brutal. It was wasteful. It was morally indefensible by any standard. But it worked. The Soviets had 34 million men under arms at various points in the war. The Germans had around 13 million. The math was simple. If you trade lives one for one, the side with more men wins. By 1944, the Soviet army had become a steamroller. They had learned from their failures. They had better equipment now. The Germans had gifted them thousands of tanks through their tanks. They had learned German tactics. They knew how to fight now. The Soviet offensives in 1944 were terrifying in their efficiency. The Soviets would just keep coming, wave after wave. The Germans called it General Winter and General Mud. But the real problem was General Zhukov. Zhukov had figured out how to break German defenses. He'd concentrate forces at a single point, overwhelm the Germans with artillery and infantry, break through the line, and pour reserves through the gap. The Germans couldn't stop it. They just didn't have enough men. By the time the Red Army reached Germany in 1945, they were veterans, survivors of years of brutal combat, men who'd seen things that would destroy most people psychologically, and they were absolutely merciless to the German population. This wasn't random cruelty or senseless violence. It was revenge for everything they'd seen, everything they'd lost. Soviet soldiers had lost entire families to German invasion. German soldiers had killed millions of Soviet civilians, not in combat, but deliberately as policy. German soldiers had starved entire Soviet cities. They'd executed intellectuals and communists. They'd treated Soviet prisoners of war worse than animals. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured early in the war and starved to death in camps. That was German policy. Soviet soldiers had marched through Soviet territory and seen burned villages. They'd found mass graves. They'd seen evidence of atrocities. They'd seen German soldiers' personal letters talking about killing civilians. And now the Soviets were in Germany, and the violence was about to get very ugly. When Soviet troops entered Berlin, There was systematic rape, murder, and looting. Estimated 2 million German women were raped. Soviet soldiers killed German civilians without hesitation. They burned German houses. They looted everything they could carry. The Soviets weren't unique in this. All armies committed atrocities in World War II. But the scale was shocking. When the war finally ended, the Soviet Union had suffered around 27 million casualties. That's incomprehensible. More than 1 in 5 Soviet citizens died. That's a proportion of the population that most countries have never experienced. Entire villages were wiped out. Families just ceased to exist. Regional populations were decimated. Some areas lost half their population, and most of those soldiers, they survived the war only to be sent to Stalin's gulags because Stalin didn't trust returning soldiers who'd seen life outside the Soviet Union. They'd seen how people lived in other countries. They'd seen that there were other ways of living. They'd been exposed to Western ideas. That was too dangerous to allow. Stalin was terrified. Stalin was absolutely paranoid about his soldiers. He thought they'd been contaminated by contact with non-Soviet people. He thought they'd start questioning communism. He thought they'd become unreliable. So he had them arrested when they got back. Millions of them. They'd survived Nazi Germany and Soviet tactics, and then they got punished for it by their own government. Some of them spent years in Soviet prison camps in conditions as bad as Nazi camps. Some of them died in Soviet gulags. Some of them were tortured. Some of them were shot. The irony was brutal. They survived the war to be punished by their own country. The real story of Soviet soldiers isn't about bravery or honor. It's about survival in a system that saw soldiers as expendable. It's about men doing whatever they had to do to stay alive one more day, with the knowledge that the day would probably kill them anyway. It's about soldiers who had to choose between being shot by the Germans in front of them or shot by their own officers behind them. It's about a military system so brutal that it makes modern warfare look civilized. It's about young men who were conscripted, given minimal training, and sent into battle as cannon fodder. It's about a country that treated its own soldiers worse than prisoners. But it also reveals something important about the Soviet people. Despite everything, despite the purges, despite the terror, despite the starvation, they still fought. They still died. They still sacrificed. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was extermination. So they kept going. The survival rate tells you everything you need to know. Over 27 million Soviet casualties out of a population of about 200 million. That's more than 10% of the entire population. If you were a Soviet citizen during World War II, you had a better than 1 in 10 chance of dying. If you were a Soviet soldier, your odds were much worse. Most Soviet soldiers who saw combat died. Some historians estimate the casualty rate among frontline Soviet troops was over 50%. That means if you were sent to the front, you had about a 50-50 chance of dying. This wasn't about bravery or cowardice. Most of these soldiers were just regular guys doing what they were told, fighting for their country, trying to stay alive. They were caught up in something way bigger than themselves, and most of them paid the ultimate price for it. If you want to see more videos about the real stories from World War II, hit subscribe. New videos every week.